A university lecture hall at the Technical University of Munich. Students fill the seats, laptops open, taking notes as Professor Ahmed Rashid discusses Middle Eastern politics with the nuanced expertise that made him one of Germany's most respected voices on the region. His lectures are balanced, thoughtful, critical of both Israeli and Palestinian leadership. He appears in German media regularly, providing analysis that politicians across the spectrum respect. His published research on conflict resolution has influenced European policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian situation. He's exactly what Western universities value, a bridge builder who understands complexity and rejects simplistic narratives. What his students, his colleagues, his media interviewers, and German security services don't know is that Professor Ahmed Rashid doesn't exist. The man teaching this lecture is Colonel Bassem Halil, a senior Hamas intelligence officer operating under deep cover for 12 years. His academic position is real, his research is genuine, his media appearances are sincere. But behind this carefully constructed life, he runs an intelligence network spanning Germany, Austria, and Switzerland that recruits sources, collects information on Jewish communities, identifies Israeli intelligence operations, and coordinates with Hamas military leadership to plan operations. This was infiltration perfected, so deep that the cover became reality, so sophisticated that even Western intelligence agencies tracking Hamas in Europe never suspected until Mossad spent 3 years methodically building a case that would shatter the illusion of Professor Rashid and expose the network he'd built using academic credentials as camouflage. The department secretary smiled warmly as she handed the professor his mail. What she delivered and what she assumed about the respected academic would become evidence in an investigation that exposed how Hamas had weaponized Western openness and academic freedom to build intelligence infrastructure in the heart of Europe. The operation to expose Halil began not in Munich but in Beirut, where Mossad case officers recruited a mid-level Hamas official who provided fragments of information about deep cover operatives in Europe. The source mentioned an intelligence officer operating under academic cover in Germany who had been so successful that he'd become a trusted voice, influencing European policy while simultaneously reporting to Hamas military leadership. The information was fragmentary, no names, no precise location, just enough to begin searching. This is the story of how intelligence services unmask deep cover operatives embedded in legitimate institutions, how universities become theaters of espionage, and how a man can spend 12 years building a real academic career that serves as cover for intelligence operations he conducts simultaneously. It reveals something darker than simple espionage, the exploitation of liberal democratic values by organizations that would destroy those values if given power, and the reality that openness creates vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services systematically exploit while counting on the very freedoms they abuse to protect them from exposure. Understanding how Bassem Halil became Professor Ahmed Rashid requires understanding Hamas's recognition in the early 2000s that traditional intelligence operations in Europe were failing. Western security services had become increasingly effective at detecting Hamas operatives who used conventional covers like businessmen or students. Background checks, database cross-referencing, and financial surveillance made these covers vulnerable to exposure. Hamas needed deeper cover, identities that would withstand scrutiny because they were substantially real rather than fabricated. The concept of deep cover academic placement emerged from studying how Soviet intelligence had successfully positioned illegals in Western universities during the Cold War. Halil was selected for this assignment in 2001 when he was 32 years old. He had served Hamas for a decade in various roles, including military operations in Gaza and intelligence collection in Jordan. His superiors recognized qualities that made him suitable for deep cover work. He was highly intelligent, holding a genuine degree in political science from a Jordanian university. He had no criminal record or documented connections to terrorist activities that Western security databases would flag. He was fluent in Arabic, English, and had studied German during his university years. Most importantly, he possessed the psychological stability to maintain a false identity for potentially decades, living a double life without the stress causing behavioral indicators that might expose him. His preparation took 3 years. Hamas sent him to Damascus, where he lived under his true identity while preparing the legend of Ahmed Rashid. The legend was built carefully with layers of supporting documentation. Ahmed Rashid was supposedly born in 1969 in Amman, Jordan, to a Palestinian family originally from Jaffa. He attended school in Jordan, graduated with honors, and won a scholarship to study in Europe. The scholarship was real, arranged through a sympathetic Jordanian academic who believed he was helping a talented Palestinian student access European education. Hallel enrolled at the University of Vienna in 2004 under the Rashid identity, beginning genuine doctoral studies in political science with focus on Middle Eastern conflict resolution. The Vienna period was critical for establishing the cover's authenticity. Hallel lived as Ahmed Rashid completely, attending classes, writing papers, participating in academic conferences, and building relationships with professors and fellow students. His dissertation research was legitimate scholarship examining how external actors influence peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. He conducted interviews with diplomats, attended UN conferences, and published preliminary findings in academic journals. The work was genuine because Hallel understood that deep cover required the cover identity to be real in every verifiable way. Ahmed Rashid had to be a legitimate academic whose credentials would withstand any background investigation. During the Vienna years, Hallel maintained minimal contact with Hamas handlers. Communications occurred perhaps twice annually through dead drops or brief meetings when he traveled for conferences to cities where Hamas maintained secure contact procedures. The instructions from leadership were clear: establish the cover completely. Build academic credentials that would provide access to policy circles. Don't engage in any operational activity that might compromise the long-term mission. This patience reflected Hamas's evolution in understanding intelligence operations. Previous attempts to rush operatives into active roles had led to exposure. The Vienna investment was building an asset who would eventually provide access worth far more than any short-term intelligence collection. Hallel completed his doctorate in 2009 with a dissertation that received high marks from his committee and was published by an academic press. His research was sophisticated, analyzing how international actors like the United States, European Union, and Arab states had influenced Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from Oslo through the Second Intifada. The dissertation demonstrated nuanced understanding of all sides, criticizing Palestinian tactical errors while acknowledging legitimate grievances, and critiquing Israeli policies while recognizing security concerns. This balanced approach made his work appealing to European academics and policymakers who valued complexity over simplistic narratives. With doctorate completed, Hallel entered the academic job market. Hamas provided subtle assistance through sympathetic academics in Europe who encouraged their institutions to consider this talented Palestinian scholar whose research could enhance understanding of Middle Eastern conflict. After applying to numerous positions, Hallel received an offer from the Technical University of Munich for a postdoctoral fellowship in their political science department. The fellowship was competitive, awarded based on his academic credentials and research agenda. Munich was ideal for Hamas purposes. The city had a significant Jewish community, Israeli business presence, and served as a hub for organizations working on Middle Eastern issues. It also had historical resonance as the site of the 1972 Olympics attack, a symbolism not lost on Hamas leadership. Hallel arrived in Munich in 2010 and spent 2 years in the postdoctoral fellowship before securing a tenure-track assistant professor position in 2012. By that point, he'd published several well-regarded articles, presented at international conferences, and built reputation as a thoughtful voice on Middle Eastern politics. His academic work remained genuinely balanced, neither propaganda for Hamas nor obviously biased against Israel. This authenticity was strategic. If his scholarship appeared propagandistic, it would attract suspicion and limit his access to policy circles. By maintaining academic rigor and appearing genuinely committed to conflict resolution, he built credibility that provided cover for intelligence activities. The intelligence mission began gradually after his academic position was secure. Initial tasking from Hamas was simply establishing presence and observing. Hallel reported on academic conferences he attended, identifying which researchers had connections to Israeli institutions or intelligence backgrounds. He noted which European policymakers attended events and what positions they articulated privately versus publicly. This reporting was low-level intelligence but valuable for Hamasan understanding European political dynamics and identifying potential pressure points. The mission expanded in 2013 when Hamas directed Hallel to begin actively recruiting sources. The academic environment provided natural cover for developing relationships with people who had access to sensitive information. Hallel cultivated students, some of whom would go on to positions in German government or international organizations. He developed friendships with colleagues who worked on security issues or had connections to intelligence services. He participated in Track 2 diplomacy efforts where academics, former officials, and policy experts discussed Israeli-Palestinian issues informally, gaining insights into official thinking that governments wouldn't share publicly. His recruitment approach was sophisticated and patient. He never directly asked people to provide classified information or commit espionage. Instead, he developed genuine relationships based on shared academic interests, gradually identifying individuals who had exploitable vulnerabilities or motivations. A German graduate student angry about Israeli policies in Gaza might share information about his father's work at the Defense Ministry. A Swiss researcher struggling with debt might accept money for consulting work that actually involved providing information about contacts in Israeli academic circles. An Austrian diplomat frustrated with his career might discuss confidential negotiating positions during conversations that Hallel carefully steered toward revealing information. By 2015, Hallel had recruited 7 sources providing various levels of information. None were high-level penetrations of security services, but collectively they provided Hamas with valuable intelligence about European policy deliberations, Israeli activities in Europe, and the identities of individuals working on counterterrorism or Middle East issues. The network operated with careful compartmentation. Sources didn't know about each other. Most didn't realize they were providing intelligence to Hamas, believing they were simply sharing information with a respected academic colleague who was helping them understand regional complexities. The network's most valuable contribution to Hamas was identifying Israeli intelligence operations in Germany. One of Hallel's sources was a German federal police analyst who worked on counterterrorism. The analyst attended one of Hallel's lectures and approached him afterward to discuss research on Palestinian political movements. Over months, Hallel cultivated a friendship, meeting occasionally for coffee to discuss Middle Eastern politics. The analyst began sharing information about investigations he was working on, not classified details but general information about Hamas activities in Germany that police were monitoring. This intelligence allowed Hamas to identify which of their operatives had come under suspicion and adjust their activities accordingly. Another source proved valuable for different reasons. A Swiss journalist covering Middle Eastern affairs for a German publication developed professional relationship with Hallel, frequently consulting him for expert commentary. The journalist had traveled extensively in Israel and had sources among Israeli officials and journalists. Through conversations with Hallel, the journalist inadvertently revealed information about these Israeli sources, including hints about intelligence officers operating under journalistic cover. Hallel reported this intelligence to Hamas, which used it to map Israeli intelligence presence in European media. What ultimately brought Israeli attention to Hallel was a pattern identified through painstaking analysis rather than dramatic breakthrough. Mossad maintained extensive databases tracking Hamas communications, travel patterns, and financial transactions. In 2016, analysts noticed unusual patterns in Hamas communications referencing information that could only have come from European sources. The intelligence included details about Israeli diplomatic activities in Germany, information about European policy discussions that were held privately, and identifying data about individuals working on Middle East issues for European governments. The level of detail suggested Hamas had developed sources with access to policy circles, but the identity of the sources or the handler remained unknown. The investigation intensified when signals intelligence intercepted and encrypted communication from Mossad military leadership to a handler in Turkey that referenced the professor, who had provided valuable reporting from Germany. Israeli analysts began searching for Hamas operatives with academic connections in Germany. The search was complicated because Germany hosted numerous Palestinian and Arab academics, most completely legitimate scholars with no connection to terrorism. Investigators couldn't simply profile based on ethnicity or national origin without creating diplomatic problems and violating German laws. They needed specific evidence linking an individual to Hamas intelligence activities. The breakthrough came through financial intelligence. Mossad tracked money flows from Hamas to European accounts, identifying patterns of transactions that might indicate operational financing. One pattern showed money originating from accounts in Turkey linked to Hamas being transferred through multiple intermediaries before reaching accounts in Austria and Germany. The amounts were small, typically under 10,000 euros, to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, but the pattern was consistent and suspicious. Investigators traced the ultimate recipients, finding one account belonged to Ahmed Rashid, a professor at the Technical University of Munich. The financial connection alone wasn't conclusive evidence. Rashid could legitimately receive money from Middle Eastern sources for academic consulting or research. Israeli investigators needed more before approaching German counterparts with allegations. They began comprehensive investigation into Rashid's background, examining his academic credentials, publications, travel history, and communications. The examination revealed something unusual. Rashid's background was impressively documented, almost too perfectly. His educational history was verifiable, but certain details seemed unusually well supported by documentation, as if someone had carefully ensured every element of his background could be confirmed. This over-documentation sometimes indicates a carefully constructed legend rather than organic life history. Mossad investigators compared Rashid's biographical information against Hamas personnel databases built from captured documents and intelligence reporting over decades. They identified a Hamas officer named Bassem Halil, whose age, educational background, and physical description matched Rashid's profile. Halil had disappeared from Hamas's visible activities around 2001, which aligned with when Rashid appeared in educational records in Jordan. The circumstantial evidence suggested Halil and Rashid might be the same person who had assumed a new identity and spent years building academic credentials as cover for intelligence operations. Confirming this theory required obtaining biometric data. Israeli intelligence needed photographs or fingerprints that could definitively match Rashid to Halil. Photographs of Rashid were easily available from university websites and media appearances. Comparing these to old photographs of Halil from the 1990s was inconclusive. People's appearances change over 15 years, and photographic comparison alone wouldn't prove identity conclusively. Fingerprints would be definitive, but obtaining them without alerting Rashid required creative approaches. The opportunity came when Rashid traveled to Vienna in 2017 for an academic conference. Israeli intelligence coordinated with Austrian partners without revealing the full scope of their investigation, claiming they were conducting routine background investigation on an individual for security reasons. Austrian security services maintained surveillance of the conference and arranged for a casual encounter where an Austrian operative, posing as a conference organizer, handed Rashid some documents in a plastic folder. After Rashid returned the folder, fingerprints were lifted from the plastic surface. Analysis confirmed the prints matched those on file for Bassem Halil from his arrest records in Jordan during the 1990s. The academic professor teaching conflict resolution at the Technical University of Munich was definitely the Hamas intelligence officer who had been operating under false identity for 16 years. With definitive proof of Rashid's true identity, Israeli intelligence briefed their German counterparts in July 2017. The briefing included financial evidence, biometric confirmation, and intelligence about the network Halil had built using his academic position. German authorities were shocked and, according to sources, initially skeptical that a respected professor could be a deep-cover intelligence officer. The evidence was compelling but created significant concerns. Rashid had published research, participated in government consultations, and influenced policy discussions. If he was indeed Hamas intelligence, his presence in German academic and policy circles represented massive security failure. German counterintelligence began independent investigation to confirm Israeli claims. They obtained fingerprints from items Rashid handled at university and confirmed they matched the samples Israeli intelligence had provided. They conducted discreet financial investigation, finding the same suspicious transaction patterns. They reviewed his communications, though encrypted ones couldn't be read without alerting him to surveillance. The evidence consistently supported the conclusion that Rashid was operating under false identity for intelligence purposes. The decision about how to handle the situation created debate within German government. One option was immediate arrest and prosecution for espionage and identity fraud. This would remove the threat, but would also expose the security failure publicly, potentially damaging Germany's reputation and creating diplomatic complications with other countries where academics might face increased scrutiny. Another option was quiet deportation, expelling Rashid without public charges and avoiding embarrassment. But this would allow him to continue operating elsewhere and wouldn't disrupt the network he'd built. A third option was surveillance and controlled exposure, monitoring Rashid while mapping his entire network before taking action. German authorities chose the third approach, deciding to conduct extended surveillance that would identify everyone Rashid had recruited before dismantling the network. For 4 months, from August to November 2017, Hallel continued his academic work completely unaware that his communications were being intercepted, his meetings observed, and his contacts investigated. The surveillance mapped his network comprehensively, identifying 7 sources who were providing information and numerous other contacts who were potentially being developed for recruitment. The surveillance revealed operational security that was simultaneously sophisticated and flawed. Hallel communicated with Hamas handlers through encrypted messaging apps that German intelligence couldn't break in real time. However, his patterns of communication, always occurring at specific times and days, revealed when he was in contact with handlers even when content couldn't be read. His meetings with sources appeared casual, academic discussions at cafes or university offices, but surveillance identified patterns showing these meetings occurred before he had communications with handlers, suggesting he was reporting on information obtained from sources. One source identified through surveillance proved particularly concerning. A German Defense Ministry analyst who attended Middle East working groups where classified information about security issues was discussed had regular contact with Rashid. The surveillance showed the analyst sharing documents with Rashid during meetings, documents later seen being photographed by Rashid in his office. When investigators examined what access the analyst had, they discovered he worked on issues relating to weapons transfers and military cooperation with Middle Eastern countries including Israel. Hallel had successfully recruited a source with access to sensitive defense information, exactly the type of penetration that could compromise security operations. The decision to arrest Hallel came in November 2017 when intelligence indicated he was planning travel to Turkey, possibly for in-person meeting with Hamas handlers. German authorities worried that if he left the country, he might not return, recognizing that increased security attention could lead Hamas to extract him. On November 16th, German federal police arrested Hallel at his Munich apartment early in the morning. The arrest was coordinated with simultaneous operations detaining 7 sources for questioning and searching numerous locations associated with the network. The arrest scene was documented by police. Hallel initially maintained his Ahmed Rashid identity, expressing confusion and claiming the arrest was a mistake. When confronted with fingerprint evidence proving he was Bassem Hallel, his demeanor changed. He stopped protesting and invoked right to legal counsel, refusing to answer further questions. Searches of his apartment revealed encrypted communications devices, a false passport in another name hidden in a book safe, and extensive notes about sources and operations written in coded language. The apartment also contained legitimate academic work, research notes, and correspondence about conferences and publications, illustrating how completely he had lived dual identity. The prosecution built case charging Hallel with espionage, identity fraud, and various supporting offenses. The trial presented significant challenges. German law protected academic freedom and expressions of political opinion, meaning his academic work and public statements criticizing Israel or supporting Palestinian rights weren't criminal even if they aligned with Hamas positions. The prosecution had to prove he committed specific acts of espionage and that he operated under false identity for intelligence purposes, not simply that he held political views or had Hamas sympathies. The evidence presented at trial included testimony from intelligence officials about financial transactions, the fingerprint analysis proving he was Halil, not Rashid, and intercepted communications that German cryptographers had eventually decoded showing him reporting to Hamas about sources and intelligence. The defense argued that Halil had distanced himself from Hamas when he left in the early 2000s, that his academic work was legitimate scholarship, and that communications prosecutors claimed were intelligence reporting were actually academic networking. The defense portrayed the case as overreach by security services targeting a Palestinian academic for his political views rather than genuine criminal conduct. The trial lasted 7 months and concluded in August 2018. The court found Halil guilty on most charges, ruling that evidence proved he operated as intelligence officer under false identity while pretending to be academic. The court acknowledged his academic work was genuine but ruled this didn't negate his simultaneous intelligence activities. Halil was sentenced to 9 years in prison for espionage and identity fraud. The sources he recruited received sentences ranging from probation to 4 years depending on their level of cooperation and the significance of information they provided. The exposure of Halil's network created significant repercussions in German academia and policy circles. The Technical University of Munich initiated investigation into how a deep-cover operative passed background checks and security vetting. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about assumptions underlying academic hiring. Universities valued scholarly credentials and research quality but conducted minimal security screening of faculty, operating on assumptions of academic freedom and openness that made them vulnerable to exploitation by intelligence services. Halil's case demonstrated that sophisticated operatives could build genuine academic credentials that provided both cover for intelligence operations and access to policy circles. The case prompted reviews at universities across Germany and Europe about security procedures for hiring faculty working on sensitive topics. Some universities implemented enhanced background checks and security consultations for positions involving access to policy circles or classified research. Others resisted additional security measures, arguing they would create a climate of suspicion incompatible with academic freedom and would discriminate against scholars from certain backgrounds. The debate revealed tensions between security concerns and liberal democratic values of openness and equality. For German intelligence and security services, the case was simultaneously a success and an embarrassment. Successfully identifying and arresting a deep-cover operative demonstrated capability and international cooperation with Israeli intelligence. However, the fact that Halil operated undetected for over a decade revealed gaps in security procedures and insufficient attention to potential threats from academic environments. Security services traditionally focus surveillance on obvious targets like mosques or known Hamas associates but paid less attention to universities, which were perceived as low-risk environments. Halil's case showed this perception was wrong. For Israeli intelligence, exposing Halil was significant success, but also a reminder of operational limits. Mossad had identified the threat and provided crucial intelligence to German partners, but the investigation took years and required substantial resources. The case demonstrated that deep-cover operatives with real credentials and careful tradecraft could evade detection for long periods. If Hamas had positioned other operatives using similar methods in other European cities, identifying them would require comparable efforts. Israeli analysts assessed that Halil was likely not unique, that Hamas had learned from Soviet illegals programs, and was positioning other deep-cover operatives in Western institutions where they could build influence and collect intelligence over decades. For Hamas, Halil's exposure was strategic failure that damaged intelligence capabilities in Europe. The network he'd built was dismantled, sources were arrested, and operations were disrupted. More broadly, the exposure revealed to Western security services that Hamas was using academic cover for intelligence operations, leading to increased scrutiny that made future similar operations more difficult. Hamas propaganda portrayed Halil as an academic persecuted for his Palestinian identity and political views rather than legitimate criminal, attempting to generate sympathy and deflect from the intelligence aspects of the case. The sources Halil recruited faced varied consequences. The German Defense Ministry analyst, who provided the most sensitive information, was sentenced to 4 years in prison and lost his security clearance permanently, ending his government career. He claimed during testimony that he viewed Rashid as a trusted academic colleague and didn't realize he was providing intelligence to Hamas, believing he was simply helping a scholar understand defense policy complexities. The court found this claim not credible given the sensitive nature of information shared and the analyst's professional training, which should have made him alert to counterintelligence risks. Other sources received lighter sentences after cooperating with investigators and demonstrating genuine remorse. Several were graduate students or junior academics who Halil had manipulated through professional mentorship relationships. They provided information about university activities, conference participants, and academic networks rather than classified government information. Courts viewed them as manipulated by a sophisticated intelligence officer rather than witting collaborators with Hamas. They received probation and community service rather than prison time, but faced damaged reputations and difficulty continuing academic careers. The psychological impact on people who had known Halil as Professor Rashid was significant. Colleagues who had worked with him for years, considered him a friend, and valued his scholarship, felt betrayed upon learning his true identity. Students he had advised struggled with questions about whether the mentorship they received was genuine or simply part of his intelligence cover. The technical university community underwent collective trauma processing how someone could live among them for nearly a decade maintaining such a comprehensive deception. The case raised philosophical questions about identity and deception. Halil had lived as Ahmed Rashid for 16 years, longer than he'd operated openly as Bassem Halil in Hamas. His academic work was real, not fabricated. His published research contributed genuinely to understanding Middle Eastern conflicts. His teaching received positive evaluations from students who felt they learned valuable perspectives. In what sense was Ahmed Rashid false if he produced real work, developed genuine relationships, and existed as a functioning member of academic community? The answer matters for understanding deep cover operations, because it reveals that the most effective legends aren't simply false identities but are real lives lived in service of concealed purposes. For German media, the story generated intense coverage focusing on security failures and debates about academic freedom. Conservative outlets emphasized the security threat and called for enhanced screening procedures at universities. Liberal publications worried about creeping securitization of academic life and potential discrimination against scholars from Middle Eastern backgrounds. The debate reflected larger German tensions about balancing openness with security, particularly regarding integration of immigrant communities and threats posed by extremist organizations. Halil's imprisonment meant his academic career ended, but his scholarly work remained. His published research continued to be cited because it offered legitimate insights regardless of the author's ulterior motives. Some academics argued his work should be withdrawn from circulation given his deception. Others contended that scholarship should be evaluated on merits independent of the author's identity or intentions. The debate touched on questions about whether truth produced through deceptive means is less valuable than truth produced by those operating honestly. In prison, Halil reportedly became reflective about his life choices. According to prison officials who spoke anonymously to media, he expressed regret about deceptions that hurt individuals who had trusted him while maintaining that his commitment to Palestinian cause justified his actions. He claimed the intelligence work was necessary to resist Israeli occupation and that Western government support for Israel made them legitimate targets for intelligence operations. This framing attempted to recast espionage as resistance, elevating criminal activity to political struggle. The operation that exposed Halil demonstrated evolution in counterintelligence toward recognizing non-traditional covers. Security services traditionally focused on obvious threat vectors, known extremists, recent immigrants from conflict zones, people with suspicious financial transactions. Deep cover operatives like Halil, who spend years building legitimate credentials and integrating into society, don't match these profiles. Detecting them requires different approaches, analyzing patterns across years, identifying subtle anomalies in backgrounds, and recognizing that institutional settings like universities aren't immune to penetration by hostile intelligence services. The case also highlighted importance of international intelligence cooperation. Israeli intelligence developed crucial evidence but couldn't act on German territory. German authorities had legal jurisdiction but lacked initial intelligence indicating Halil was a threat. Only through cooperation, sharing intelligence, and coordinating investigation could the operation succeed. This cooperation occurred despite sometimes difficult political relationships between Israel and European countries on Middle East policy, demonstrating that intelligence services can work together on security threats even when their governments disagree on diplomatic issues. For Hamas, the Munich operation's exposure led to operational changes. Intelligence from interrogations of network members revealed that Hamas recognized Halil's compromise might have resulted from financial transaction patterns that created investigative leads. Hamas reportedly shifted to more sophisticated financial tradecraft, using cryptocurrency and informal value transfer systems that are harder to trace through traditional banking surveillance. The organization also increased compartmentation of deep cover operatives, reducing communications and providing more operational autonomy to avoid creating patterns that counterintelligence could detect. The long-term impact on European counterterrorism was increased attention to academic and professional environments as potential settings for intelligence operations. Security services expanded monitoring of universities, particularly departments dealing with Middle Eastern issues, security studies, or defense-related research. This monitoring created tensions with academic communities who viewed increased security presence as threatening academic freedom. Universities pushed back against what they perceived as intelligence service overreach, while security officials argued that protecting against hostile intelligence operations required some level of institutional cooperation. The story of Professor Ahmed Rashid, who was actually Colonel Bassem Halil, ends not with any dramatic resolution, but with quiet imprisonment in a German facility where he serves sentence while his case becomes training material for counterintelligence officers worldwide. The Technical University of Munich removed his name from faculty lists and withdrew honors he'd received. His published research remains in academic databases, cited occasionally by scholars who footnote that the author's identity was subsequently revealed to be false. And somewhere in Munich, students still sit in the same lecture halls where Halil taught, most unaware that the Middle Eastern politics course they're taking was once taught by a Hamas intelligence officer, who used his position to recruit sources and collect intelligence while appearing to be exactly what Western universities value most, a voice of moderation and understanding in a world of conflict.